Good afternoon. It's 1:15, and because we have so much to cover, I wanted to get started right away. I expect people will continue to join us over the next couple minutes, which is absolutely fine. I'm going to get started though. So thank you all very much for joining us. This is our second webinar in our series on providing trauma-informed clinical care during COVID-19. This is a free training, and it's a result of grants from the Monmouth County Department of Human Services, the Division of Behavioral Health Services. They were awarded to the Mental Health Association of Monmouth County, the YMCA of Greater Monmouth County, and the Society for the Prevention of Teen Suicide. Today, we're going to be discussing grief and trauma as it pertains to the adults and children and families, with a focus on the specific ways that COVID-19 is impacting people right now. I'm Marnie Rhoda. I think I've emailed almost all of you. Maureen Underwood and I will be taking you through today's webinar. Maureen has a practice specialty in grief and trauma. She began her work in the 1980s developing support groups for children whose family members had cancer. She has worked in her practice with couples, families, and children after traumatic losses, and has published extensively on topics related to complicated grief. So you're in really good hands today. So we saw this same slide last week, but it bears repeating. So go ahead and read it to yourself for a minute. So we're going through something we haven't gone through before. This is hard. What we are doing in this series is giving you the essential clinical information you need. We're giving you practical tips on how to use it, and we're reminding you how to support yourself along the way. That's the best we thought we could do in this situation. So you're going to hear this several times today. If nothing else, I think you'll probably remember this phrase after the webinar today. Some of you are probably working with clients who are grieving a loss due to death. What we are talking about today, however, can be applied to any loss anyone is experiencing, because loss is loss is loss. So let's talk about non-death losses for a moment. This is our first poll for today. I'm going to go ahead and launch it. I just want to get a feel, and I want everyone to see the different kinds of non-death losses that people are experiencing right now. So go ahead, the poll should be launched for you. Go ahead and indicate some of the losses that you've been seeing from your clients and people you're working with, and we'll take a look at it in just a minute. If you have others, this is where you can jump into the chat and share with us some of the other losses you're seeing. Okay, so I see lots of people adding things, and some people are adding things in chat. Go ahead, I'm going to stop this poll from running, and then if you have other ideas, I'd love to have you go ahead and put them in the chat for me. All right, I'm going to share the results of the poll, and while I'm doing that, you can still add things to chat or take a look and see what people have added to the chat. So what I see here, the most popular answer was loss of connection with friends and family. That's that isolation, I think, that lots of us are feeling. But you see, there's a lot of loss here. Lots of people reported loss of milestone moments, loss of job and income, loss of personal space. That's a big one for me. And then in the chat, people shared things like loss of routine, loss of motivation, a loss of physical contact. So true. So you can see death of friends and family members, loss of services. I mean, so please page through this, because you want to be on the lookout. And, you know, we're talking about loss throughout today. Today's theme is loss from beginning to end. And when we're talking about loss, what we're saying applies to all of these losses. The impact they have on us and what we can do to help people, all of that applies to all of these losses and more. So I'm stopping the poll so we can move on, but feel free to keep looking at that chat. I think Yes, we saw this slide last week too. We got this list of challenges that are facing clinicians right now from a report that was published in April. Today's content is going to address client fears of loved ones becoming ill or dying, complicated grief, and managing our own reactions to those things. I'm going to turn it over to Maureen, who's going to take you through our plan for today.
Thank you, Marnie. Hi, everybody. I want to thank those of you who joined us last week who came back, and welcome those of you who weren't here. Thank you for coming. I want to reinforce that although we're going to be sharing theory and content with you today, we couldn't do this if we hadn't had the opportunities through the years to be witnesses on the grief journeys of so many adults, of children and families. They're the voices that are giving us the words that we're sharing with you today. And we would like to start this presentation off by honoring their courage and their strength. We would also like to dedicate the time we're spending together to those of us who are no longer with us because of COVID. So we'd like to take a couple seconds of silence for all of us to remember someone you knew, someone you loved, or someone you read about who has been impacted by COVID. So what you've got on here is how we're organizing our content for today. There are volumes and volumes of information about grief and trauma. It's one of the reasons that we are going to ask you on your evaluations if you've got topics you'd like to hear more about. We know we're just touching the surface, but what we wanted to do was organize the information in a way that relates to some of the challenges that you all may be experiencing because of COVID. So that's how we selected the content to go over with you. And as we did last time, we start with the definition. This is the definition of grief. And as you all know, grief is a very complex process. It encompasses a wide range of emotional responses, subjective experiences, physiological changes, behavioral reactions. Anything that happens to us is really in response to a very significant loss. And I think this is interesting to kind of think about. Grief results from the interplay between two very opposing forces that are really inherent in our nature. That innate resistance to change and that inevitability of having to change. So you can kind of hear it's almost like the clash of the titans. When there's a serious loss, it really does threaten our own personal reality. And to kind of take you back to something that we talked about last week, we really can talk about grief very broadly as the distress occurs when those assumptions we hold about life are shaken because we have this life-changing event. And just to remind you, what we talked about was that life was meaningful, benevolent, and the fact that we all have self-worth. How are you going to use this information with yourself? We wanted to, again, point out that helping someone after a loss is a special challenge. Most of us are doing what we're doing to help people because that's sort of our nature. And there's something about the experience of grief that really precludes our ability to help. You know, I got an email this week from one of the families that we had worked with September 11th. There's actually going to be a Zoom call that a lot of the families are having to get back together. And I was sharing with her what Marnie and I was, you know, what we were doing. And, you know, kind of saying what I said to you earlier is that we'd learned so much from them. And she said to me, you know, when I would bring my daughter to your offices to see you, she said, I remember this one time she said, my heart is broken in a million pieces. And I thought about no matter what we do for people, we can't put those pieces together. I want to share what I think is a pretty eloquent quote by John Balby, who did the seminal work on attachment and loss. He says, the loss of a loved person is one of the most intensely painful experiences any human being can suffer. Not only is it painful to experience, but also painful to witness, if only because we are so impotent to help. And, and thinking back over, the years that I've been working in death and loss, I think that it struck me that there were three ways that this really affects us very personally. First of all, it makes us aware of our own losses. There's no way you can work with a loss event without thinking about yourself. It also can make us aware not just of our actual losses, but of our feared losses, which we usually keep at a low level of awareness. But with COVID, it's kind of like that rear view mirror. You look out the side of it and you see things kind of approaching you. We see death out of the corner of our eye. And it's hard to kind of put it off to the side. That reminded me of how this also kind of puts us in touch with our own mortality. Years ago, I worked in oncology, and I had a nurse colleague. She and I worked together, and we went to Trenton once to have a meeting with the Department of Health. There had been a upsurge in lung cancer deaths in women, and we went to kind of share some of our experience with them. And I remember that these people we talked with asked my colleague how she could work with death every day. And I truly have never forgotten her answer. She said, there's a lot of worse things that can happen to you in life. And I think that that's the kind of perspective that helps you stand up in the face of death and still look at life. And I'd encourage all of you, because I think you're all going to be faced with loss and death in some way in the next several months, several years, to look at your own grief history. We have an activity in your workbook called your grief closet. We'll talk about that a little bit later, but it really does help you get a look at, what your own loss history has been. And it can be really, really helpful because unfortunately, there's some losses we carry with us forever, and you need to know what they are so, you can kind of put them in perspective if you have a client or a student who's got something very similar. We also wanted to talk with you about the factors that complicate loss, and you probably, as you're looking at this slide, are thinking, they must have been very hungry when they put this slide together. And that may have been true. I can't actually say that it wasn't, but what I can say was, even up to this point, this was for Marnie and I to come up for air. We talk to you all about coming up for air all the time. We have to come up for air too in teaching this. We just can't keep ourselves in the depth of it because it's pretty heavy. And there's actually a symbolism to this piece of cake because complicated grief is like the nuts on the frosting. Grief in itself is hard enough, but when you have those extra complications, especially as they relate to the pandemic, it just makes it a little more challenging. And that's what you're seeing, the nuts on the frosting. So let's take a look at each of these factors that complicate grief in order. The first one is trauma. And what I want to say about traumatic grief is if you look at that blue circle there, the blue circle is just how we react to any kind of death or loss and the grief process that we have to do just because we lose something or someone that's really important to us. Yellow circle is what happens when there is some trauma mixed in with it. And, it could actually be the death or it could be the threatened death. And I think again, you can see with COVID, all of that traumatic circumstances that are kind of complicating it. And what we see happens in that overlap area is where we have traumatic grief. So not only do you have the symptoms and the feelings of grief, but you might also have some of the symptoms that are very, very similar to PTSD. So I want to point that out to you because I think that with that traumatic grief, we often may have a preoccupation with loss. It's hard to let it go. There's that difficulty acknowledging that you couldn't say goodbye. I think that we're hearing about a lot of traumatic grief that healthcare workers have who are choosing. And I think that word is so important because I think they're choosing to say goodbye for family members. And there's a great amount of trauma that they're carrying with that and a lot of purposelessness about the future. So what do you do about this? How do you use this with your clients? Well, again, you want to remember that you've got some of those PTSD-like symptoms. So you want to identify the ways in which the grief is intrusive. Are they having dreams? Are they re-experiencing, situations around the person or the thing that they lost? Intrusive thoughts. How you help them with that is really explore what are some of the things that could be exacerbating intrusions. I'm sure that you all know people in your life that when you're in a difficult place, they're the last people you want to talk to because they always make you feel worse. There may be some people that, your clients need to stay away from because they're making things worse. Or just watching the news, overdosing on all of the information that's out there that just kind of challenges us to make sense of this. And news reinforces things that are newsworthy. They're not necessarily always telling us about the things we're solving. They're the big problems we have. What you want to do is engage your client in problem-solving strategies to decrease those intrusions. You're not going to tell them what to do. You want them to figure it out for themselves. I think it's a really important thing to remind people that what we pay attention to is a conscious choice. So if they're consciously choosing to pay attention to the intrusions, they can choose that to pay attention to something else. And if it's appropriate, you can help them focus on the life of the deceased or the meaning of that loss in that structured kind of way. You've got a resource at the bottom of your page. You also have it on the resource page. It's an old book, and some of the references we're giving you this time are tried and true. They just work. These are daily meditations for working through grief, and I would often give these. And I would give these. I just bought a bunch of them. They weren't that expensive. And I would give them to every member in a family. And because they say today you look at this thing, tomorrow you look at this thing. Sometimes families just couldn't find words to talk to each other about what happened. But what they could say is, gee, did you read the meditation for today? That made a lot of sense to me. So it's one way to structure and try to help get people on the same page after some of those traumatic situations. It's that support, control, and structure. There are some people who have traumatic grief experiences who need treatment because of that PTSD component. And the reason they need treatment, here are some of the things that treatment provides. First of all, one of the things is that if somebody has lost a relationship that was secure and unconditional, they need to replace that. And one of the goals of a therapeutic relationship should be to replace that relationship. It's a place where people can express complicated feelings that they may just feel very guilty about expressing to someone else. Ambivalence, sometimes I liked him, sometimes I hated him. Or, I know her dad is dead. I know my mother and my sister are really having a hard time. I didn't like him. He was really mean to me, and I have to tell you, I'm glad he's not here. So you are providing that holding environment for some of the things people cannot say anywhere else. You also can help the client focus on the past, present, and future. When we're grieving, we tend to be focused on the present of what happened and the past of what was wonderful or what we didn't do. We sort of leave the future out of the equation. So it helps get just a perspective of the fact that even though you're in a sad place now, there's a place to go. And last week when you looked at those COVID maps, you kind of saw that was a direction we were going in. That's one of the concrete ways that you can do that. And again, it's recognizing the fact that people have so much pain and helplessness that if they can do something to be in control, they will overcome that helplessness by being helpful. And it may be being helpful to someone else. I think in the answer to one of your frequently asked questions from last week, we put something in there about how you try to help people, even people who are struggling with thoughts of suicide, to reach out to others, because that does minimize some of that sense of, I can't do anything. Another factor that complicates grief is sudden loss. And no big surprise, there's the shock that comes with that. And it's not unusual to have those nightmares and intrusive images, especially under these circumstances. Oftentimes, sudden losses exacerbate feelings of guilt. These are the if onlys. If only we had talked to each other before. If only I had made that last visit. If only. It's about the unfinished business that comes with sudden loss. Now, my observation about this is when people get into these if onlys, most of the time what they're going to tell you is, if only I had done such and such, something would have been better. I've never heard anybody tell me, if only I had done this, maybe things would have been worse. And what you know from people's lives, sometimes if only I had that conversation, that might have made things worse instead of better. So I certainly don't go and change anybody's perception of that if only, but at some point in time, people usually come around to understanding that there's a reason for unfinished business and it's absolutely okay. And we're going to talk later about some ways you can help people kind of pull that together. There's also the need to blame that comes with sudden loss. The family may be the scapegoat. Why couldn't they shelter in place? How come they exposed, grandpa to that thing? It could be the hospital. Some people are blaming the president for the lack of national strategy. There's other people who are blaming COVID. And particularly you'll see when this is a death that's related to another cause. It's not a COVID death. It may be a cancer death. But because of the isolation that's been created around COVID, what could have been a personal loss, we could have been in the hospital when my father died from cancer, but now we can't be, it's the fault of COVID. So not only do we need to understand to know the cause, but many times we're needing to understand so that we can assign some blame. And sometimes people just feel better when they can blame someone or something. How you use this with your clients, I want you to remember that when people have a sudden loss, they're pretty numb. They're shocked, and they might not even know what kind of help they need. So don't start with the question, what can I help you with? That often is, what can I do for you? Don't go there. Try instead something that sounds like, I'm so sorry for your loss. We've unfortunately received a lot of calls from people who have experienced a sudden loss. I'm here to talk with you and work with you. Put that in your own language, but please don't try that. What can I help you with? Because people look at you blankly and say, I don't know. One of the ways we know that helps people with sudden losses is being able to see the body. We learned that in our work with families who've been impacted by September 11th, that many of them never received any remains. And that remained an issue for some, I'm sure it still does, but it really remained an issue for a very, very long time. So what you try to do, and again, I'm just giving you tries, because some of these situations, they're really, really tough, but you try to focus rather on the meaning of that person in your life rather than the way they died. So it's what you're holding on to is, when we talk about the process of grieving in a little bit, you'll see that's kind of the end point of it. And that's what you're trying to get them to. It's important to use the word dead. Don't use euphemisms because they're confusing and they cloud the issue. Someone hasn't passed away, they've died. You haven't lost that person, they've died. And in this particular situation, I think that community resources can be some of the most helpful things you have. Grief support groups, I know Monmouth County has lots of them for lots of different reasons. I'd really encourage you, take a look at those, because those are so important to help people feel that camaraderie and that normalization that comes from other people who've been in a similar situation. The last thing I want to start with is kind of this very same thing I started with this slide, is what you say. Be careful not to handle your own helplessness with platitudes. It's going to be all right. You're going to be okay. That may or may not be true. And that can be a false promise. I think the best you can ever say to people, to most people, is you'll survive. You may not feel like it now, but you'll survive. Another situation that we face, and I don't know that you may know exactly the wording of this, and so that's why we wanted to tell you, it's called ambiguous loss. So listen to this, because it's it may sound a little challenging. This is when you have and I'm going to use a person for this because it's just easier. You have a person who's perceived as physically absent, but they're psychologically present. So, for example, you have healthcare workers who are living in hotels, who are in basements, who are quarantined. I was going over this presentation the other day, and my 11-year-old granddaughter was sitting nearby, and she heard me talking about that. And she said, this reminds me of my friend Isla. Her father is a doctor at the hospital, and when he comes home every day, he has to take his clothes off in the car, and then he goes into the basement and takes a shower, and he stays down there. He doesn't even have dinner with the family. And I will tell you, that was confusing for her, and I think it's especially confusing for children to understand that. The second kind of ambiguous loss is the person's physically present, but they're psychologically absent. And this could be someone, for example, who's in a coma or on life support. You have families where you have someone who is challenged with an addiction. So they may be physically present, but they're really not there, or someone who's disengaged from the whole family system. The loss is confusing, it's difficult to understand, and because it's so ambiguous, people really tend not to support it so much, or they don't know how long to support it. And I would tell you that it strikes me that one of the ways as a society, I think we're attempting to address this is in cities, you see where people come outside at 7 o'clock at night and make a lot of noise for healthcare workers. Supposedly it's a reminder to them that, we care about them even though we can't see them. I think it's not just for the healthcare workers. I think it's for ourselves as well, as a way to acknowledge those ambiguous losses, as well as the heroes we can't see who are being separated from their families. So I think that that's an important thing to recognize with ambiguous loss. How to deal with this with your clients, the level of loss can really stay the same, and people don't know when it's going to end. So, you think of those healthcare workers who may be on the front line for even longer. So because the loss is ongoing, there's a relentless uncertainty with it, and it's exhausting. It's just exhausting. I think of seeing some of those families on early on who, some of the newscasters who had a family member who had COVID, and they were taking care of them in the basement of their home, or in a closed bedroom, and they were putting the food outside their door, and how exhausted they looked. And this is because this is really very, very exhausting. To me, the analogy is, it's like, when you were taking one of those long car rides with your kids, and every 5 minutes they kept asking, "Are we there yet? Are we there yet? Aren't we there yet? Are we there yet?" And that reaction you got when you had to answer that same question 27 times, it's that same reaction families are having to this. It's a never-ending roller coaster. So what's important to do, because this can often get misdiagnosed simply as depression or anxiety, is you want to look at all areas of functioning, because you may see some of those little PTSD things in there. Those physical somatic complaints, that preoccupation, rumination, agitation, need to talk about it all the time. You may see some irritability, some anxiousness, but exhaustion is one of the major things you'll see with this, and it's particularly with the helpers who are trying to really kind of manage this. The next thing we're going to take a look at, and Marnie's going to help us with this, is something that we're calling an unclear threat.
Thanks, Maureen. The current circumstances have certainly provided us with an unclear threat. And why? Because this virus is silent, it's invisible, it's an enemy we can't see. We're getting mixed messages from our government, from our friends, from the media about what's important right now and what we're supposed to do. And there are more unknowns about the future than there are knowns. So what do we do with an unclear threat? How do we respond? Some of us default into thinking that nothing has changed, denying the threat completely and the new reality. Let's face it, if there's a way to deny reality and avoid it, some people are just going to do that. The other reaction that we're seeing is hypervigilance. So that's when we start looking for problems and threats everywhere. For example, consider the decision-making process that many of us have to go through to decide if we're going to leave the house and go shopping or get something done. The many precautions we go through our head that we're going to take, and the decision-making process about how we can do that safely. It certainly complicates things right now. Now, with these complications, what does grief look like? What happens? Well, the grieving process is going to be significantly impacted because in order to grieve, the irrevocability of the loss has to be established. Without accepting a loss, we're likely to ignore solutions and options we need to move forward through that loss. So an example of that is someone loses their job. With the presence of an unclear threat impacting their grief, perhaps causing them to be in denial, they stay fixated on the job they lost, on getting that job back, and are potentially ignoring other options and other opportunities available to them. Similarly, when a response to an unclear threat is hypervigilance, we'll see similar paralysis, a lack of movement, too many options, too complicated, don't know what to do. There can be almost a frozen impact to that. So what can you do? What's your job here? In both scenarios, the idea here is to provide some perspective so that people can start to widen their focus away from the threat to looking at the big picture. Be aware that this is a process, not an overnight thing, and you're going to need to be patient. The shift you're looking for is one that looks like it's not how did we get here, but where are we going from here? That's what that would look like.
Well, thanks, Marn. So what we're going to talk about now is another factor that complicates grief. This is something that are called finite losses versus non-finite losses. Finite losses obviously are death. They're losses that have a boundary. This happens, this person is gone, they're never coming back again. There are three main factors that separate non-finite loss experience from a death loss experience that's finite. First of all, the loss and the grief is continuing and ongoing. Even if it follows a specific event, like a diagnosis of COVID, there's all those other losses that are kind of attached to it. Secondly, loss prevents those normal developmental expectations from being met. So for example, a non-finite loss, and this is not related to COVID, but it's, I had a client who had multiple myeloma. And as you know, that can be a very long-lasting cancer. And he was just always waiting to die. Even 15 years after the diagnosis, he had one eye on that rearview mirror and he could see death in his face. What happened was he couldn't plan for the future. His wife wanted to move. They wanted to do something with their grand. He couldn't do any of that because the loss was so ongoing and he was so preoccupied. And he couldn't do those developmental things that would help him have moved into the later part of his life. The other thing that this includes are those intangible losses, such as those losses of hopes or dreams or ideals related to what a person could or should or might have been. I think of this in particular to those young athletes who've had their careers ended early because they've had some kind of injury. And you just always kind of know things are not going to stay the same, that they're always going to get worse. And you somehow feel like you're not quite normal. In terms of COVID, here are some of those non-finite COVID losses. Certainly, we hear about that second wave. We don't know when it's coming. We don't know if it's coming. We don't know what's going to make it come. We don't know whether once you have it, is the immunity something that's going to be permanent? Is life ever going to return to normal? There are some folks who are feeling like, and you look at some of the economists out there, who talk about the impact on the economy, that it may be a generation before life returns to normal. And one of the questions about that future is, are we going to pay more attention to science? We didn't seem to pay very much attention to the threat of a pandemic. If you listen to what Bill Gates has to say, he feels that pretty strongly. Are we not paying attention to the warnings about climate change? Are we going to find ourselves in the same mess in 30 or 40 years? How long are we going to have that in economic insecurity? Or is there going to be another bailout? And really, can we trust our leaders? When you look across the world and one country's doing one thing and other countries doing another, how do you decide who do you trust? And certainly, I think that, these are things that kind of weigh heavy on us. So I think I'm going to have Marnie come in and try to help us come up for air. Maybe help me come up for air.
I think we all need it. So this has been some heavy stuff, which is always a good time to come up for air. The trick with coming up for air is that we have to have our list of ways we like to come up for air handy. We have to have it maybe in our mind or maybe in writing beside us. So it's easier for us to do it when we are low and running out of emotional energy, which felt like a really good time for a poll. Great. So for this poll, we're going to ask you to imagine that you're with a client right now, and you and your client have just been dealing with some heavy stuff. What can you do? I'm going to go ahead and launch the poll. Oh, here's an important note. So I'm going to launch the poll, and then you can also share some ideas in the chat. Here's what went wrong last time. I apologize. When you go to the chat and share an idea, especially one like this, you have a choice to share to all panelists or panelists and attendees. You need to make sure you're sharing your chat with attendees so everyone can see your ideas, not just me. So I'm going to launch the poll. Go ahead and mark things down. And this time when you chat, just make sure you're chatting to attendees, not just panelists. Okay, so people are still voting in the poll. Oh, and chat ideas are coming in. I'm going to share them as they come in for a couple minutes, and you can still write them down. Stretch together, progressive muscle relaxation, grounding exercise, take a walk outside, guided meditation break, mindfulness exercise, body scan. Maureen, someone after your own heart suggested ice cream.
Ah!
Okay, so super. I'm going to go ahead and stop the poll and share the results so everyone can see where we're at here. I'm noticing in the chat a couple questions about the recording of the webinar. So just so I don't lose track of anyone who's asking, if you need to leave and want to get a recording of this webinar, email me. So I've emailed all of you. You should have my email. It's my name, marnyrhoda@gmail.com. Email me and I will get you the recording after the webinar today. Okay. All right, Maureen, as we can see, a lot of people like a lot of these ideas. And I think the go-to is just acknowledging this has been heavy really can help. That validate.
Great.
Thanks, Maureen.
All right, what we're going to do now is talk kind of about the way we look at grief. The wisdom figure in the field of grief and loss for many, many years was Elisabeth Kubler-Ross. And her work focused primarily on the feelings of dying. That was her original stuff. It got switched to the stages of grieving at some point in the process. And a lot of people take that very, very literally, even people in healthcare roles. The stages of grieving imply some kind of passivity, though. I think it kind of means you just sort of pass through it. And that's why we like this model much better. This is about the tasks of grief. This comes from William Worden. We've given you this reference, even though this book was written in '93, the 5th edition just came out. So it's been updated. And if you only get one book, this is the book you need to get. Because it really does give you structure, support, and control for the grief process. This is about walking through it. And it's it sounds simple. It's not quite that simple, as you all know, but it's acknowledging that reality. You can see how Marnie has talked about that some of those losses, the reality doesn't get acknowledged. Experience those feelings, and that's where Kubler-Ross stuff comes in. One of the things about the feelings I want to say is that people feel the way they do. There's not a set feeling. There's not an order of feelings. For example, someone who is never angry in their life is not going to be angry about death. Someone who's angry about everything is probably going to get angry about a death. So it's really letting people have the integrity of their feelings. adjusting to the changes or all the things in the world that are different because this person has died. And one of the things I think Worden points out so eloquently is he talks about when the process is done, you've emotionally relocated that, and it's no longer external to you, it's internal. Now, what I'm just going to say, what happens with this is as you go through this process, and every time you recognize a new change in the environment, you have to go back to the top of this and accept the reality of that loss and process through. So that's why even with one loss, there's a lot of what I like to call umbrella losses that go along with it. And that's why it can often take so much time. We also know that it's not just the nature of the loss, but the way people look at loss that complicates grief. So here are some of the ways that people look at loss that we know are complicators for the grief process. And the first one is something called anticipatory grief, and that's grief that occurs prior to the loss taking place. This was a term that was coined in the 1940s by a researcher, and there had been this nightclub fire in Boston. And there were a lot of people who were very seriously injured after this fire. And, you know, he was watching kind of what went on with a lot of their family members or survivors. And basically what happened was, because they knew that this person was going to die, they began the process of normal grief before the death actually happened. And so by the time the death took place, they had done some emotionally freeing of themselves from that person. This is, you know somebody's going downhill. Just what it does is, death is coming closer. And what this does for us, again, and I keep going back to this rearview mirror, but there it is. There's that existential anxiety that gets exacerbated because your own personal death awareness is heightened when you're in the presence of death. As you watch somebody die, you can't help but think about your own death. And this is what's happening with COVID. We absolutely know it. And when it's an older member of your family, like a parent or a grandparent, there's also an awareness that you've moved up that generational ladder. I call it the food chain. You're the one who's going to be the next in the order of things to die. So you can see what anticipatory grief lets people do is some of that work of worry before the death takes place. How are we going to manage? Where are we going to live? It's role rehearsal, and it's very, very normal. So, some people feel like that's an insensitive thing to do. It's one of those things that's really useful to help people and encourage them. And I know that, I've been talking about this in relation to death, but we want to make sure that you understand that this is also about other kinds of losses. So here goes Marnie telling us about the prom picture.
Yeah, exactly. Now, and I do want to apologize because this is shelter in place in the suburbs. My neighbors have decided to all mow their lawns during this webinar, so I apologize if there's lawnmowers in the background of me. So as Maureen said, anticipatory grief about death is real right now, but it doesn't mean that there isn't other losses. There aren't other losses for which we have anticipatory grief, and they are not trivial, although sometimes they do feel trivial. So some of those losses that we're seeing anticipatory grief for right now are things like students like these two who might be missing milestones like their prom. I want to point out that I did not look like that girl at my prom. I'm not sure, Maureen, if you did, but that wasn't the look I brought.
Never once in my life, so not just the prom.
All right. Yeah. So anyway, but they're a good example of some of those losses. Other losses are student athletes, like Maureen mentioned, who are worried about their athletic careers, parents who are concerned about their children's academic progress and future right now, furloughed people who are unsure if they'll get their jobs back, families who are unsure when and if they're going to get to see those out-of-state family members and what that means for family life in the future. And I think really, perhaps all of us who are anticipating the loss of life as we know it. Now, to take it to the next level, potentially, of trivial, I do want to share that this week I was watching the new Kenny Chesney music video. It features these huge sweeping crowd shots, 50,000 fans singing and dancing together in a big stadium. I have tickets for both the New Jersey and the Boston shows in August. And as I watched the video of that and thought about how much I love being there and doing that, I was crushed because I realized I wouldn't be there in August, maybe not for years to come. And it's very real that that's not part of my life anymore. So with that example, my reminder for you here is validate, don't minimize. It might not seem like a big loss in the context of the big losses we're facing, but loss is loss is loss.
So Marnie, I hear that you are pretty sad about not being able to see Kenny Chesney.
I am, Maureen. I am sad about it. Thanks.
And I'm also going to come up for air for you all on this slide because my 15-year-old grandson was around. He's the one who puts the workbooks together. So he noticed the slide and he said, what's that prom picture doing in there? And I said, well, you know, we're talking about other kinds of losses. And he said, but she's got a prom dress on. And I said, well, you know, lots of people are kind of putting their prom dresses on, you know, as kind of a way to deal with this. And he said, oh yeah, she looks really sad. I thought, well, at least he is still a young 15 because I sure thought she had a different look on her face, but what can I say? Anyhow, we're moving ahead now to another type of grief called chronic sorrow. And a picture of chronic sorrow is, I'm sure most of you remember the Godfather movies. And if you think of the Godfather movies, there are always these scenes in the garden where all these older Italian women were sitting and they all had black dresses on, right? They were all widows and their husbands had probably died years ago, but their chronic sorrow was they wore black for the rest of their lives. The loss itself is ongoing. The grief doesn't end. It just goes on and on and on. And as long as you focus on the loss, you're going to be grieving. It came home to me with a mom that I worked with who had lost her son in September 11th. This was her youngest son, who was in his early 30s, but he was really her baby and kind of her favorite, I would say. And he had just gotten married about 2 weeks before September 11th. And she didn't really know the daughter-in-law really well. She wasn't necessarily fond of the daughter-in-law. And because he had gotten married, she was no longer his next of kin. So she got no information about anything that was happening for survivors of that loss. And it was as if it was on her shoulder for years, the rest of her life. Something good would happen with one of our other children, and she would always go back to the fact that she wasn't going to experience that same event with her son. So I think that it's important to see how this goes on and on and on. There's so many losses related to COVID that may be chronic for people. Their level of income, they may never be back at the same level. Their businesses, their homes, their security, they're going back to that bottom line of Maslow. And if you look at the lines for food pantries, there have been a lot of comments about how they look like the bread lines in the Great Depression. You know, and that kind of reminded me of you know, my mother was a depression baby, and it was a way of life that never left her. You know, especially as she was older, you know, there was this feeling of just never having enough. And I can remember once asking her why we never used paper towels. Everybody else I knew seemed to have paper towels in their kitchen, and we always had a wash rag. And her message was, you know, things are not disposable. You need to make the best of what you have. And it struck me that there always was for her that level of sadness that came from her childhood in that era of having nothing. What I want to point out to you, though, is it's important to look at chronic sorrow vis-a-vis clinical depression, because sometimes they look the same. It's important that we recognize the difference. With that chronic sorrow, that lack of energy is really related to that exhaustion that we talked about earlier. When you're constantly grieving, you're exhausted. It's hard to really focus on life energy when you're feeling like you're in the throes of death. With depression, the lack of energy tends to be related to the mood disturbance, okay? So it comes from a different place. The symptoms are more diffuse with depression, and you can't usually attach depression to a single event. With sorrow, you always can pinpoint. I always knew when my client was really sad about things in her current life, she was thinking about her son. I just always knew it. And she would actually start to cry over it. As long as that loss was present, that sorrow was going to be there. With depression, you know, it can be temporary, it can improve over time, it may respond to medication. Chronic sorrow often does not respond to medication unless you've got some premorbid depression with it, comorbid, that might respond to the medication, but that chronic sense of emptiness is really, it just is there. It just is there. So another loss that kind of ties in with that a little bit is something we call disenfranchised loss. And this is when a loss is not openly acknowledged, can't be socially sanctioned, you can't publicly mourn it, which of course is something that you're seeing with COVID. You also see this, for example, with people who have relationships that nobody knows about, their secrets, and one of the partner dies and they can't participate in any of the rituals or funerals. People who have miscarriages, that's often a disenfranchised loss. People just kind of, oh, you lost the baby. And we're back to that lost. It just kind of takes away the real meaning of what happened. We can actually even see this within family groups where there's a member of the family who attempts to control the grief reactions of others or just doesn't allow people their own grief response. You know, I think you can see, for example, when it's my ex-husband dies and my children are really, really sad, and it's really hard for me to let them be sad because I'm glad he's dead. Or the other time, you know, to kind of move to those other kinds of losses that we've talked about, you know, somebody loses their job and, you know, they're feeling pretty crummy about it. And everybody, well, you hated that job anyway. You didn't like it. You were going to look for another job. So you see how it really kind of discounts what that loss is all about. The other thing that we haven't really acknowledged, and I think this is really, really important, is that sometimes disenfranchised grief can promote a spiritual crisis. The bereaved can feel abandoned by God. You know, this is the God that they depend on for solace. This is where they have prayed, and put this in conversation with that lost assumption of the meaningfulness. I lived my life the way I was supposed to. I did everything right. I followed all the rules. I took care of myself and my family. I was always a good employee. And now we've lost everything. We're going to be on the street. And what does my God have to say about that? So I think that when it's exacerbated by those shattered assumptions, this can be very, very powerfully depressing and overwhelming for people, and we don't usually talk about it. So I think it's important to kind of weave that into your conversations about grieving, because there's a lot of people for whom spiritual consolation is what gets them through. And they may not even realize they've lost this. And so what I want to do is I'm going to turn this over to Marnie, because she's going to talk to us about some of those other disenfranchised losses that come, especially with COVID.
Thanks, Maureen. So, you know, I think this is something that we can all relate to, because I think we're all experiencing some of those disenfranchised losses, especially because, like I just mentioned over there in anticipatory loss, the losses might feel a little bit trivial to some of us. And when they're trivial and they're in the face of big losses, we might keep them to ourselves. We might leave them unvoiced, or they might feel unrecognized, because in the midst of so much sickness and death and financial hardship, we can feel that our losses are being ignored. That's why we included a pre-work section in this week's workbook. I'm not sure if all of you got a chance to take a look at it, but there is a section called for your own disenfranchised losses. And we know you're probably keeping some of them in. I've even seen in the chat as we're going on, people sharing some of them there. We're keeping them in. Go ahead and do that exercise. That's really the best way for you to take your own inventory of where you're at with that. And then when you do that, you can then use that same exercise with your clients, because it's something that I think we all need to work on. So wrapping up these different kinds of grief that we've just talked about, we're going to do a poll. And in this poll, what we're going to do is we want you to tell us how you'll be adapting the things we've talked about into your work. So this is the place where you're going to share with us your takeaways so far. Give me 1 second to launch this poll. All right, so I'm launching the poll. There's, again, another opportunity for you to put some of the ideas, some of your takeaways, how you're going to use this information about the types of grief with your clients in your chat, reminding you did a great job last time when you chat to all panelists, not just to us. I just want to mention that I had lots of fellow live music fans in the chat, Maureen. People also mourning the loss of live music. Okay, so most of people have already voted, and I'm seeing things. I'm seeing things in the chat to encourage clients to focus on the positive things they can do now. Have them tell the story of their loved ones. Change the focus, gives meaning to loss. Psychoeducation about grief and grieving process. We're big fans of that. Find ways to honor the loss. I'm going to try to remember clients, help clients look at the future. So there's a lot of good things here. Go ahead, and this is a place where I'm going a little bit slower here, taking a little time. Take notes from what we put in there. Take notes of what your coworkers and people that you're in this training with are sharing in the chat. There's some really great stuff there. So I'm going to leave the poll up for another minute for you to write down anything you want to there. Again, name and validate the loss, by the way, at 90%, that's a tactic that all of you are doing, and which is key right now, especially with those non-death losses. Someone likes the word in thought about adjusting to changed environment, that fourth stage of grief. Okay, so as you can see, there's there's lots of different ways to work with these different types of grief and bring it into your practice. I'm going to end the polling and share the results. You can just see there some of your favorites. We have one more type of grief to discuss, and Maureen is going to take us there. I'm going to stop that.
Thanks, Maureen. This is not, we didn't leave this to say last but not least, because it is not least. And truthfully, we could actually do a whole webinar, a whole day training on dealing with unfinished business. This is it. I think that picture just captures it so well. Not being able to say goodbye. That, ritual of dying and gathering one's loved ones around them brings lots of comfort and closure to those of us who are the grievers. And it really gives us support to come together. And we don't have that right now. And that's really a huge missing piece, to not have those rituals that surround dying. And again, these are not just for people who are dying from COVID, they're from all kinds of other reasons. And even though this happens before, there's always times when someone lives across the country, or you're racing to get to the hospital and you can't get there before they die, or they die suddenly alone. I think because of the volume of people experiencing this, it's becoming, kind of a societal loss. And a lot of what happens to us when we're in this situation is we often feel guilt-ridden because we couldn't be there for that person. And when there's really no reason for guilt, We didn't do anything wrong. The circumstances are really what are preventing us from being there. It's not our fault. And, in trying to figure out how we were going to talk about this, I had read an article in the New Yorker. You have the information here. It was April 20th. And this was a story about a young woman who was a police officer in New York City. And her father came down with COVID, and he was in a hospital that was in her precinct. So she could stop, she would stop in. And she went in to see him, and the doctor who was tending him stopped her outside his room. And this was what she reported he said to her, because she wanted to go in and say goodbye to her dad. I want you to visualize a conversation right now I'm going to have with your father. Imagine I'm walking into his room as his doctor and asking him if he would feel comfortable with you coming in to see him. I'm telling him about the risk to you and your family if you went in there. What would he say? Would he want you to say goodbye to his spirit in there or out here? And what this woman said was, she stood outside the room, she listened to this, and she understood that her father would not want her to go in the room. And so it really did help her some in this extraordinarily difficult situation. But what we wanted to do, and I'm going to turn this to Marnie, was to try to give you some ideas about some of the other ways that you might be helpful with this.
Yeah, so these are some very concrete ideas you can use with people who haven't been able to say goodbye. We learned a lot about this when we worked with our 9/11 families. These activities will work with children, with adults, with family groups. So the first activity is writing a letter to the deceased. You might want to give them a prompt, something like, "Something I want you to know," or "You will be so proud of me because." This can be a one-time activity, or you can have your client write several letters over time, which might be just the right thing to do to support your client in their saying goodbye. Another option is to have a goodbye conversation with the deceased. This gives people a chance to say what they need to say, and there is nothing wrong with talking to a person who has died. It's a very successful coping response. I guess thirdly, one of the things that we saw a lot of and that really helped was having someone visit a place that had special meaning. It can be a way to say goodbye. For our 9/11 families, many of them went to the beach to do this. Just being in that special place in the honor of the person who has died can help bring a connection to the deceased and move people closer to acceptance. I think finally, another idea here is taking action by doing something that mattered to their loved one. Some of our 9/11 families started foundations, which is great, but something much simpler and less intricate than starting a foundation, like cooking a loved one's favorite meal as a family, can be useful here. We even had our families compile a cookbook of all their loved ones' favorite recipes. The kids did the artwork and everyone loved doing it. The goal of all these activities is to provide an opportunity for a belated goodbye, let some of the anxiety go away, and begin to recognize that separating without goodbye does happen, and they can move on the road to reinvesting in their own lives.
And one last thing I want to say about that, I think that, again, this is where it's so important to remember this process takes time. When we made that cookbook with our 9/11 families, it was a couple of years after 9/11. So, if you have short-term relationships, this is kind of challenging to do. But when you've got long-term relationships, this kind of sneaks in at intervals where you can begin to do this in more than one way, because sometimes you have to say goodbye a lot, The other thing that we want to point out for you is kind of what does it mean to provide therapeutic support for people who are grieving? And what we wanted to say is, even though we reinforced before that especially people who've had traumatic loss events might really benefit from counseling, not everybody needs counseling or therapy. And what counseling and therapy looks like can be very, very different than, you come into my office once a week, or even, you do telehealth once a week or twice a week. Sometimes it's kind of on as ad needed basis. And I've had clients where it went on for years, but it was just here and there. They needed to drop in at certain times. Maybe it was at significant life events. Maybe it was anniversaries, or maybe it was just they were struggling with something. They needed a little bit of listening and holding to kind of get them through. So while everyone doesn't need counseling, everyone does need support. And I think that that's important to see, that somebody may come to you and they don't need, a psychotherapeutic intervention other than supportive counseling. One of the other things that you want to do is you want to get to know something about the person who died. And that's asking questions. At the end of the day, their lives always mean more than their death. If you look at obituaries in newspapers, and unfortunately, there's so many more now than there have been in a very, very long time. There's one line about how the person died, isn't there? But the whole rest of it is about all the amazing, important things they did in their lives, even if it was as simple as they just were a good pet parent. So I think it really is important to refocus on that life. And one of the ways to do it that makes a lot of sense is chronologically. And it's starting way before the death and kind of moving up to that ending. Sometimes what we see is something that's called the process of obsessive review. And this is a very, very normal thing, and I want to explain it to you. If you've been in some of my other trainings, I always tell the story about John and Mary, because it just is the story that speaks this to me. So let me tell you the story of John and Mary, and you'll kind of see what I'm talking about. So you have your friend Mary, and her husband John dies suddenly. So this is in a period of time when you can go to the wake, you can go to the funeral, and you're in the funeral home, and you're waiting online. You get up to the front, you get to Mary, you say, "Mary, I'm so sorry, John died. What happened?" And she says, "Boy," she said, "I wish I knew." She said, "We went out to dinner the night before. We had that Italian food. He loved Italian food. He got a little indigestion. He always got a little indigestion. So we didn't think anything of it. Took some time, so it was all right. He got up the next morning. He was still not quite feeling himself, but he got dressed. He went into work. He's in his office. His colleague came in and asked him, he was going to Starbucks. What did he want? And his usual macchiato or something or other. His friend went and got the coffee, brought it back. And when he came back, John was slumped over on his desk. Unresponsive. They called 911. They came right away. They did CPR on him, everything they could, but they couldn't save him. You say, "Oh, Mary, I'm so sorry for what happened." So you kind of move along. The next person in the line comes up and they say, "Mary, what happened?" And Mary says, "I don't know. We went out for Italian food the night before, indigestion, Tom's over his desk, cappuccino." She tells the whole story over. Mary has to continue to tell that story. And it always starts when John is still alive, and she has to tell the story up until the point when he's dead, until she has come to terms with accepting the death. And you'll know that when, so you say to her, "Gee, Mary, I heard John died. What happened?" He had a heart attack." That's when the obsessive review is over. And people need to continue to do that until they can come to terms with that ending. It really is important to try to find members of that person's support system who can support that process, because everybody has their own account of what happened. And, Mary's telling this to her daughter. Her daughter's got her own obsessive review to do. She can't get involved with her mother's. She's got her own. So it's often people outside the system, and you may become that person as their therapist who can do that. The other thing that you want to look for in that support system are people who can gift the family with memories. This loss didn't just happen to Mary. It happened to a lot of other people. Happened to all the people in his workplace, that colleague who brought him coffee every day. So sometimes reaching out to those people and asking them to share their stories with the family. Could you share me a story about, that was always a crazy kind of coffee that John wanted? Can you tell me when he started to ask you for that, and, kind of how you got in the habit of bringing it to him? Could you write me a note about that? And it's often good to have people write these things down, because they fall away. We think we're going to remember every single important thing, and they fall away. time does that to our memories. But that's why if they're written, they're things families can really hold on to. And I think that they're so, so important because they expand the life of that person. I have more to hold on to now because you shared so many memories with me. This is especially important when you're dealing with children and families. And Marnie's going to take us through a little bit about children and families right now.
Yeah, so I am going to move us towards some specific information about children and families. We know there's very specific challenges for children and their families during this time. One that I want to highlight from the outset is helping families get on the same page. How can we do it? Keeping in mind the fact that children's grief can look so different developmentally. This topic, honestly, could be a whole webinar on its own, and our intention is actually to have a webinar this summer specifically designed to support schools working with children as they return to school. But we don't want to not cover this information, at least briefly now. So for starters, we're going to do a quick poll just to check in to see if you're working with children. I think we have a poll slide. All right, so this is just an easy, quick one. This won't take a lot of our time. Yes, no. Are you working with children? I'm going to go ahead and let you indicate. And as we guessed, this is mostly yeses. Okay. So votes are still trickling in, but I'm going to end the poll because I can see very clearly that 84% of you are working with children. So this information we understand is you're hungry for. We know it from notes that you've sent me over time on different things that this is what you want to hear. The 15, 16% of you who aren't working with children, I would say this information is probably as important for you because many of you are working with parents, and parents need to have this information. You need to be able to talk with parents so that you can help families get on the same page. So give me 1 second. Let me stop these results for you. Great. So this is what the tasks of grief look like for children. You can see the parallels between this and the work of Worden we saw earlier today. I want to take a minute though to emphasize this first phase, which can get overlooked. Children absolutely need to understand a loss at their own developmental level before they can move on, which means that adults need to be able to give them very simple explanations of what's happened. If we can't give them simple explanations, they can't understand what happened and they're going to stay right in that early phase. So for a death, a simple explanation is something as concrete as something happened to a body that causes a heart to stop beating, and when that happens, a person dies. I'm going to turn it over to Maureen now, who's going to talk about adolescence.
So there are some things I think that it's important to realize about adolescence. There is no time in the life cycle when death is more psychologically disorganizing than adolescence. And those first 2 points on the slide kind of emphasize what that is. Adolescence is the time when you're supposed to figure out who you are, who you're going to be, what are you going to do with your life. And if you have to factor death into the equation, it's kind of like, why bother? I'm sure you've heard that saying, life's a bitch and then you die. Well, it's too much work. What's the point of it? And it also, kind of flies in the face of those adolescents who feel like they can control anything. I don't know that I've met too many adolescents who don't feel pretty omnipotent. And when you're in the face of death, it doesn't matter what you do. There's nothing you can do that you can control it. And it's especially unsettling when you have kids who are vulnerable because already they're starting with some things that are making them unsettled emotionally. And when you add this on top of it, we're back to the nuts on the frosting. Kids may also personalize a death. If it could happen to him, it could happen to me. We always know that, a death by suicide can kind of spark a contagion, that exposure to that death. But what we know with adolescence, it's exposure to any death under any circumstance, particularly of a peer or someone who's a role model to a kid. It just makes them think like, oh my gosh, if it could happen to them, it could happen to me. It's that existential anxiety that gets activated in all of us. And reactivating other losses is really where that grief closet comes in. We've used that grief closet activity with kids in elementary school, middle school, high school. You know, I met with a group of high school athletes who had lost one of their peers. And, you know, we talked about, you know, all the way we kind of hold loss inside. We don't have to grieve a loss when it happens, but we stuff them like we stuff them in a closet or we stuff them in a drawer in our house. And these boys reminded me, no, sometimes we stuff them in lockers. So whatever it is you've got, there may be a place that opens when you have a loss and it reactivates all those other losses. So let me go through what kids need help with, and I'm going to go through each of these boxes one by one. Reestablishing safety and security, you want to focus on what they're doing to keep safe, not on the unsafe things. They may be worried about the safety of family members, and let them voice their concerns. You know, my sister goes out and she doesn't wear a mask. My mother goes shopping and I don't think she keeps social distancing. Especially some younger kids are really worried about those very strict protective things. What you want to do is go over with a family. Their plans are, what are they going to do if somebody does get sick? Who is going to take over? Who is going to do whatever needs to be done in the house? It's like a fire drill. You know, most families practice a fire drill. In case of a fire, this is what we do. It never happens, but at least they know. So it's that practice and rehearsal that can make you feel safe. That trusting relationship, that's really identifying trusting adults. And I certainly have worked with enough kids who say, I don't trust any adult. So what you want to try to do is we use the trick of having them identify people they perceive as helpful, harmful, and neutral. So you kind of put on a piece of paper, helpful, harmful, neutral. Obviously, you've told me there's no one helpful in your life, so we'll skip that category. Who are the harmful people? Most of the time, they have no trouble telling you all the people who are harmful. But then you say to them, you know, there's a category called neutral. Well, who's in that neutral category? And usually they can give you, well, maybe my neighbor or, you know, my youth minister or my sister's boyfriend. Somebody is in that neutral category. And what you can do is you can make someone neutral into somebody helpful. You can't make a harmful person into a helpful person. It's too big a jump. But you could make that neutral person. So I think it's important to kind of do that. Validating the impact, you know, not being able to finish your senior year is a big loss, isn't it? Tell me more, those three magic words. Assistance in grief, that's again explaining that concept of symbolic losses and doing psychoeducation and that grief closet. Hope for recovery. One of the ways we do this is we use joining words, because hope is something that people often feel because they feel isolated and alone. So we encourage you to say things like, I know you feel alone, but I think if we put our heads together, you see how you've joined with them, we may be able to figure out some things that will make you feel better. Even though there's division in our country right now, look at all the people like you who are trying to do the right thing. So you're trying to alleviate some of that aloneness, and that recognition of suicide risk is simply asking the question. You know, sometimes in times like this, people feel so terrible, they think life isn't worth living. I wonder if you feel that way. And next week, that's what we're going to really be spending our time on, is talking about suicide risk. I want to do the very same thing with traumatized adults and families, and we really recommend working in families that have had traumatic loss events for varieties of reasons. So let's go through each of these. In terms of learning how to communicate what happened, what we often have families do is we have them make lists, and this is again the family together. You make a list of all of the things that have changed because this loss has happened, and all the things that haven't changed. And we ask every single person in the family to make their own list. If there are children in the family who are too young to write, we write for them, and then everybody compares their lists. So it's a very non-emotional way to be able to see where people are on the same page. Addressing blame and anger and guilt and shame, what we do here is we refocus a family, and we refocus them on the brave things that each family member has done to get through this. And we have everybody write down a brave thing I have done, a brave thing my brother has done, my father has done, my mother has done. And so we just have everybody do that. And we also ask them to focus on the future and talk about, here's a brave thing I have to do. I will tell you, I worked with one little girl once whose mother had died very suddenly. She was in second grade, and I can remember asking her that question, what was one brave thing she had done? And she said to me, she thought about it for a couple of seconds, and she said, a brave thing that I've done is I go to school and I don't cry. And I could say that's a pretty courageous thing to do. Again, identifying and adjusting to future losses and understanding and respecting differences. This is where those COVID maps we had you draw last time can come in really handy. Because again, you're looking at where you are now, where you've been, and where you're going to go. And it's in a concrete way. People can draw it if they can't find the words. It's real simple. I will just tell you, adults take forever to draw. Kids have it done in 2 seconds. So you have to be patient with the adults if you do any drawing activities. Preserving family members, particularly if somebody has died, we often have them create containers, concrete containers for those memories. We would often use boxes, and we would have every member in the family decorate one side of the box or share a side of the box with one of their memories that was important. And then we would use that box to put in those statements about the brave things, maybe their maps, anything that those memories that other people gifted the family with, things that they might write on holidays or birthdays. So there was a container where everything was in a place. And again, it's a visual for containing some of the impact of grieving. And again, preserving those memories also helps recognize those family strengths and resiliencies. And again, it's remembering that bravery comes in small doses. You don't have to do big things to be a brave person. So your takeaways from this, Marnie, I think you're going to wrap us up with this.
Yes, I am. So I want to wrap up this whole section on children and families by highlighting some of the strategies you can use with children and families to get them on the same page that Maureen just talked about. So those grief maps, they work for all ages, and they give that great visual understanding of the journey. Fire drills, making plans for what to do if something happens, can help establish safety and security. Saying, I just love when Maureen says this, it really stands out for me, saying, let's see what we can come up with if we put our heads together. The joining words can provide some much needed hope in those hopeless situations. Discussing, even making a book of family recipes can help families get on the same page. That switching the focus from the guilt and shame to that one brave thing can help families widen their focus and bring a new perspective. And finally, articulating the different changes, the good and the bad and the no changes. Maureen talked about what's changed, what's not changed. Add that extra category of what's changed that's for the good and what's changed that's for the bad. I think in the chat, I think Sue actually shared this a couple minutes ago. That idea that some of the changes that are happening are good changes. For some kids, there's no bedtime. The whole clock has slid out the window, and time is now very relative. So that could be a good change for some people. So helping families identify good, bad, and neutral changes can let everyone kind of see where everyone is and help them come together on one page. So Maureen is now going to bring us into our home stretch.
You may not think this is a coming up for air activity because it shows a sinking ship. It's actually the Titanic, but it really is. So let me tell you how we use this. All of us know about the Titanic. There's nobody who hasn't heard that story, but very few people know about the Olympic. I bet if we did a poll right now, maybe there'd be a handful of you who knew the Olympic was the sister ship to the Titanic. She set sail about a year before the Titanic, went back and forth across the ocean throughout the 1930s, never sank, came in for a repair every now and then. But, that was really kind of what happened with her. We don't know about the Olympic because she didn't sink. Now, I would tell you that most of us remember the Titanic moments in our lives, don't we? And I think that COVID is going to be a Titanic moment for the entire country, maybe for our entire lives. But even in the middle of those Titanic moments, we have Olympic moments. things that just simply get us from here to there. That's all they are. And our days are made of so many more Olympic moments than Titanic moments. We just don't pay attention to them. So imagine if you started to catalog some of those Olympic moments. Some of the simple things like, you got up in the morning and you got, before the alarm went off, you got an extra cup of coffee. You got to watch what you wanted to watch on TV. You got 20 minutes alone with nobody bothering you. Those are Olympic moments. They're not moments where you have to have excessive gratitude, because I don't know about all of you, but I have days when gratitude is a hard place for me to reach, but I always have a day when I have an Olympic moment. My days start, for example, I have a little Cocker Spaniel who wakes me up every morning. My Olympic moment is 6 o'clock and there's a squeaky toy in my face. It reminds me that somebody is happy that we're starting a new day, and I just can't help but smile at that. So I think it's important, if you can, not just for yourself, but for your clients, begin to identify some of those Olympic moments. It's going to help you, because we know helping hurts. We are not going to go into compassion fatigue, vicarious traumatization. We may talk about that in our last webinar, but we really, the way we've been structuring these, and I hope you can notice, is we start out kind of easy. The heavy material comes in the middle, and we go out light as well. So we don't want to go out with clinical definitions of vicarious trauma and compassion fatigue. What we want to go out is reality slapping you in the face. It's just normal. It's happening to all of us. It is not something that requires a clinical definition. It's just a tough time. And I would tell you, it's as Sigmund Freud said, sometimes a cigar is just a cigar. So don't make a big deal of it.
So what can you do that you might not have thought of? One of the things we want to leave you with is stop trying to be so positive. Many people right now might not be at the stage that they're ready to feel better. That's okay. Meet them where they are. You don't need to fix it. Another tip we want to leave you with this week is to shake things up a bit. Do something unpredictable. This can be a great way to come up for air or to shift your own focus. Maureen has given us probably the best example of this strategy ever. Here is Maureen doing a TikTok with her granddaughter. If that doesn't remind you to come up for air and try something new, I don't know what's going to.
Also, don't take yourself seriously.
So, wrapping up where we are and where we're going to be and where we'd like you to go in the next week. Here's the things that we'd like you to consider. Taking an inventory of your grief and loss closet, that's in your workbook. Identify self-care strategies for yourself as well as for your clients. You do have a coming up for air exercise in your workbook. Please keep adding to that list so you have many ideas at the ready. You know what? I think we all need to say no sometimes, now more than ever. We're not capable of doing maybe all the things we used to be able to do during this time, which means we have to say no. Identifying an Olympic moment every day is a great tip from Maureen. And this is another piece of art and writing from Brian Andreas, who clearly is one of Maureen's and my favorite. We look to him for inspiration and joy, and we've been doing it for decades. So I'm going to recommend that as you're searching for ideas about coming up for air, maybe you check out his Instagram. He is posting regularly beautiful little snippets. They're short, they're brief. It takes a minute to read and take a deep breath, and maybe it resonates with you. I'm going to put his Instagram in the chat while I turn it back over to Maureen.
So we see the same picture that we had from last week, but this week we have a quote from The Little Prince, and I'm sure there are many of you who remember this story fondly, by Saint-Exupéry. In one of those stars I shall be living. In one of them I shall be laughing. And so it will be as if all the stars were laughing when you look at the sky at night. And when your sorrow is comforted, time soothes all sorrows, you will be content that you have known me. This reminds us at the end of a day that what we hope to hold in our hearts is the life of the person we loved, not the way they died.